Hello and welcome to the Sciences of the Origin project. We are glad to have you join us as we delve into the philosophical and methodological foundations of the scientific quest for the origins of the universe, life and mind through interdisciplinary perspectives. The main aim of this project is to discuss common methodological challenges of cosmology, biology and archaeology. The Sciences of the Origin interviews are supported by University of Oxford project New Horizons for Science and Religion in Central and Eastern Europe, funded by John Templeton Foundation. My name is Monika Milosavljević, and I'm an assistant professor of archaeology at the University of Belgrade. My guest today, in many ways, needs no introduction. Steve Mithen is a renowned expert in prehistoric archaeology. He is professor of early prehistory at the Department of Archaeology at the University of Reading. His work explores late Pleistocene and early Holocene hunter-gatherers and farmers. He is also a proponent of cultural heritage for sustainable development and community archaeology, and is a well-known expert on the evolution of the human mind, language, and the music. Among his many published works, he is best known for his books, The Prehistory of the Mind and The Singing Neanderthals. Stephen is one of pioneers of cognitive archaeology. He has striven to find answers to the hardest questions in archaeology, and that's great. What's more, he's a unique educator. He's able to make extremely complex reasoning in archaeology accessible to the wider public. So hello, Steve. It's so good to have you for this interview today. We are happy to have you.
Well, hello, Monika. And hello, Monika. I'm delighted to have been invited to take part in this fantastic series that you have organised.
Thank you very much. So I would like to start off by asking, what work had you or others done that had led you into exploring the prehistory of the mind and origins of art?
Oh, goodness. Well, archaeologists often spend their time, and I spend a lot of my time, focused on the details of the past. We dig in the ground and we find little artifacts, or we do meticulous recordings of objects and fireplaces and structures and cave paintings. So often we're looking at the very detailed. And sometimes I think archaeologists forget to ask about the very big questions. And I suppose in the earlier part of my career, maybe about 25 or 30 years ago, I was seeing people in other disciplines asking those big questions about the nature of being human. So biologists were asking those, and physicists were asking those, and linguists are asking those. And they're often speculating about the human past and how we developed our intelligence, our creativity, our language. But none of them were talking about the archaeological record. And they didn't have much idea of the fossil record. And I thought, archaeologists need to contribute to this because we're the ones that understand the complexities of archaeological data. So it was partly because I think archaeologists need to address those big questions, and because other people from other disciplines were doing so and not really using and sometimes misusing the archaeological evidence. So that persuaded me to begin thinking about these really big questions about what it means to be human and what archaeology can contribute to that.
Yeah, thank you for asking big questions. That's so important. So when we are talking about prehistory of the human mind, what would you say? What archaeological evidence do you think is most important in that regard?
Well, there's often the archaeological evidence, if we think of that in a broad terms, often falls into two broad categories. On the one side, there's human skeletal remains. And many people writing about the evolution of human mind or intelligence or whatever we want to describe it, focus on the skeletal remains. They look at things such as the size of the brain or reconstruct the vocal tract. Now, I actually don't think that type of skeletal data is as useful as the artifacts that are left behind, either those that are made or the artifacts, how they're distributed across a landscape or how they change through time. And the reason for that is we can go a long way back into human past, at least 300,000 years, and we see that the brain case of Homo sapiens is much the same as it is today. And indeed, you can go further back in time and we've still got fairly large-brained hominins around, but they're behaving a very different way. So I think the amount of information you can gather from the human skeletal remains in the Archaeological record about the evolution of the human mind is quite limited compared to what one can potentially extract from looking at how stone tools were made, when the first objects were made, how people were spread across the landscape, how they organized their societies, their economic behavior, how they dispersed across the globe. And all of that requires the nitty-gritty of the archaeological evidence, all the materials that we excavate, and not just the objects, but also the context in which the objects are found and how they need that to be interpreted. So you've got also the dating of them, the environmental context in which they're found, their associations. So interpreting archaeological remains is quite complicated, sophisticated business. But I think that's the essence of trying to get to the human mind, rather than relying on the skeletal remains themselves, although they're obviously important.
Okay. Based then of those contexts, artifacts, complex relations, landscapes, according to your research, what are the key differences and similarities between different human types? Let's say Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis, and newly discovered Denisovians, and so on.
Yes. Okay. Well, I mean, that's a huge question, isn't it? I mean, I think what I'd first want to stress is a great unity among all of humans. You know, if we'd gone back, if we were talking 20 or 30 years ago, we'd have had a rather small number of humans. We'd have had probably Homo erectus, and then Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, and Homo sapiens, as if it's a progressive ladder onto ourselves today. But today we have an explosion of different types of humans in the past. Not only those four, but as you mentioned, the Denisovians identified from genetic material alone. We have Homo floresiensis, we have Homo naledi, Homo luzensis from the Philippines. So there's a huge number of different types of humans in the past. And we know that at one time, perhaps around 500,000 years ago, several of these humans were living at the same time on the planet. Today is a rather unique situation where there's only Homo sapiens alive. So the first thing I'd like to stress is a degree of unity among all of these humans. And us today, Homo sapiens, we are just one type of human. You can be human in many different types of ways. And what I wouldn't want to do is make any value judgment between these types of humans. You know, it'd be like making a value judgment between a cow and a horse. You know, they're both unique, brilliant, adaptive animals in a way that Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis and Homo ergaster and Homo habilis were all perfectly formed, brilliantly adapted, unique types of humans. So first thing is, I think we should recognize a whole similarity between those. And one of the great similarities is that we all make extensive use of material culture at a level which is much greater than we see in any other types of animals. We know chimpanzees and we know crows and we know otters. They all use material culture a little bit. But humans make a huge use of material culture, and it's fundamental to their adaptation. So I think there's a huge unity in humankind of all those types of humans before we start looking for differences. Now, what are the differences, however? Well, I think Homo sapiens stands out from all of the others. And there's one obvious reason why we do. We're the only ones still living on the planet. All the others have gone extinct. Now, we might ask, why is that? Is that something to do with us? Or is that just by chance? Well, we don't know. What we do know is that Homo sapiens has a remarkable capacity for communication, for use of language. And I actually think it is the origins of language at around 100,000 years ago that really separated us from all those other types of humans and ultimately gave us some competitive advantage. And when I say language, I don't just mean a sophisticated communication system, because we know that Neanderthals and Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis, they must have had very complicated communication systems. But I mean a particular type of communication system, a particular type of language, one that uses words and grammar, because I think that those haven't only changed the way we communicate with each other, but I think they've fundamentally changed the way we think. And they've given us a degree of creativity, a degree of abstract thought that has allowed us to become an especially creative, imaginative, technologically advanced type of human, constantly changing a culture. And I don't think any of the other humans were able to do that. I don't think they had spoken language with words. And the consequence was that they were constrained in their type of thinking that they're able to do. I stress that isn't a value judgment about them. It's simply an observation, an objective observation of what the archaeological record is telling me.
Okay, you said something about evolution of language, but can we discuss a little bit more about role of music in the evolution of human mind?
Yes. I mean, music is such a fascinating question, and it's been really neglected by not just archaeologists, but by so many academics. Because, what archaeology should be addressing is, what are the fundamental characteristics of being human? What's as important being human and how did they arise? And one of the human universals found in all known societies is making of music, singing, dancing, using instruments. It's pervasive in all cultures. And nobody's ever really given an adaptive reason for that. Why is music so pervasive there? Why is it so important to us individually? Now, so one of the questions I've wanted to look at is where did music evolve from? Why have we got music? And when I was addressing that, I began reading a great deal about what other philosophers had written about music and what some scientists, including Charles Darwin, had written about music, and look at the role of music-like communication animals. And also thinking about the question of how did our ancestors, before spoken language, with words and grammar, communicate? And I've come to the view that a music-like form of communication is much, much older than spoken language with words. And in fact, it was the original type of language. And we can look at how animals such as monkeys, chimpanzees, whales, birds, all sorts of those, they communicate using variation in pitches, in rhythms, in tones, in timbre, in little melodies. And I think that's exactly what our ancestors were doing, but in a much more sophisticated form, a much more sophisticated way. Homo sapiens, I think, then embellished that by inventing words. And I think spoken language was an invention. I don't think it was a genetic evolution. I think it was an invention. They invented words, which then developed this additional form of communication that we call spoken language. And hence our ancient musical form of language has become our music today, that we really enjoy, we still use for lots of functional purposes, like communicating our emotions, especially for social bonding. It's hugely important for building social bonds between groups, between societies, between individuals. But much of its ancient communicative powers have now been overtaken by spoken language. So I wrote a book called The Singing Neanderthals, because I think Neanderthals did lots of singing and lots of dancing, partly for fun, but partly because it was really key to their survival in that Ice Age world.
I like that relation and thinking just about the emotions and music, animals, humans, all that pictures are very important when we are thinking about deep past. So, but can you tell us also about humans' capacity for visual symbolism? So how might we interpret that capacity?
Yeah, well, this is really difficult, isn't it? Because one of the hardest things is to define what a visual symbol is, because visual symbols can be those artificially created by humans, but you can just use a natural object. Often in my pockets, I have little shells or little stones that I've picked up at times, and I put them in my pockets to remind me about somewhere nice I've been. So when I pick that up, oh, it's like a symbol to me, but it's a purely found object. And that makes a lot of archaeology difficult, because when we're excavating a site from an ancient type of human, we might find some natural objects on there, like shells or stones. They might have had great symbolic importance for those people in the past, but we have no way of recognizing that. The other type of visual symbols are the ones that human make, that are entirely artificial, that we don't find in the natural world. In archaeology, the most dominant and the earliest forms and the most well-known are, of course, the first cave paintings that we find around 40,000 years ago, or maybe earlier, maybe 60,000 years ago. And we find them in the painted caves, not just in France and Spain, but now in Asia and Australasia. And we can have a good guess that they're representing something symbolic. They're a bit like a word. They represent something that is entirely arbitrary to what you're seeing in there. So there might be a handprint, or there might be a painting of an animal, or just an abstract mark. And we think that they are encoding some information about the world, whether it's a belief, whether it's a memory, whether it's a story, through that particular image itself. Now, that seems to be a capacity that modern humans have. You use that, Monika, all the time. I use that symbolic capacity all the time. All modern humans do. We don't really think other non-human animals use that symbolic capacity. Some argue that they do, but it's very, very rare if they do. And looking at the archaeological evidence, it's very difficult to argue that any humans prior to Homo sapiens had that symbolic capacity. Now, some argue that the Neanderthals did, and they will point to potential paintings in caves, blobs of paint on cave walls that have been dated now to around 60,000 years ago. And they say, well, they must have been made by Neanderthals. And there's a few other potential Neanderthal symbols. And I think Neanderthals may well have had a limited symbolic capacity for visual symbolism, but it didn't become as pervasive and as critical to their social life, to their communication, to their being in the world, as visual symbols are for humans. And of course now, everything we have is a symbol, even if I don't intend it to be symbol. My phone's a symbol, my glass is a symbol, the jacket I'm wearing is a symbol, because you, Monika, will be reading all information into that, either consciously or unconsciously. So we live in a total symbolic world now, where everything is symbolic. I think the Neanderthals lived in a world where little thing was symbolic, and most other early humans lived in worlds where nothing was symbolic at all. So it's really, really crucial for us, and trying to understand the origin of symbolism is really important.
So that was a fascinating answer to this question. But the aim of this project is to talk about the problems of archaeological evidence. So we should be more explicit about that. So, for example, in the early days of archaeology, there had been many stereotypes in reconstructing the origins of different phenomena in prehistory, specifically when discussing Neanderthals. They are not discussed. But what do you think are the blind spots of our own time when we are talking about the past, let's say prehistory?
Well, that's a really, really interesting question. And of course, the whole history of not just archaeology, but all disciplines have been pervaded with what would now look back as, say, biased views. Or we can be more frank. We can look back to the 19th and early 20th century and say they're biased by racist views coming from especially Western academics that are imposing their views on the past. I would now say they're blatantly racist or blatantly discriminatory, and that's exemplified by attitudes to Neanderthals, when the first skeletal remains were interpreted as being as some form of rather shambling, thuggish brutes. And then, of course, we have all the sexist language in archaeology, which has biased the interpretation of the past. Now, the problem we have today is, of course, that we're not necessarily aware of our own biases. You know, unconscious bias is such a huge issue. And however objective we might become, I know that 20 or 50 years down the line, somebody will look back and say, oh, well, Stephen Mithen was so biased by his political views at the time, or Monika was so biased in that way. We can't really escape them, but we can try to. So we can try to become as objective as we possibly can. I suppose recently we've become more aware of some of these. We do recognise, by looking at the history of our discipline, how it has been pervaded by sexist and racist views. So I think we can become very aware of those and try to control themselves. I think one of the risks we have at the moment is to confuse difference with making a value judgment. So, for instance, when I'm writing about the difference between Neanderthals and modern humans, I've often been criticised by archaeologists who say, I'm trying to make Homo sapiens better than Neanderthals. I'm not, I'm just trying to recognise a difference there. So I do worry that we have become too afraid for saying that there are differences in the past. There's differences between one society and another society. And there's differences between one type of human and another type of human. Because of political pressures today to not make value judgments. And I worry sometimes there's a pressure on academics not to be prepared to say, I think there's differences, because of the fear we have of potentially imposing our biases onto the past and potentially being seen to make value judgments. So that's one issue. The other issue that we face is that our archaeological record is still so very biased towards certain parts of the world. We still know so little about the human past in Africa, for instance. We know a lot about Europe. We know quite a lot about Southwest Asia, but quite what was happening in Africa between, say, 500,000 years ago and 100,000 years ago still remains so sparsely known. So our interpretations of the past are still very much biased by the history of past archaeological research, which was dominated by research in Europe and other parts of the world. That, I suppose, that colonial record as well. So I still think we're working with very partial archaeological record, and it's very difficult to come up with an interpretation of the past that can be fair to that whole breadth of the archaeological evidence, because so much we're lacking at the moment.
Thank you for this, because I agree. History of discipline is important for reflexive thinking in all that dimensions. As Alison Wiley said, reflexive thinking in archaeology can be concrete, so it should be concrete, so we can have better insights. But due to indirect nature of archaeological evidence, what do you think, what are the best practices and methods to prevent the selection effect when researching origins of art and mind? You said something about interdisciplinarity, but can we go into that a little more?
Okay, well, I suppose I'd put emphasis on two factors. First, I'll emphasize the value of excellent archaeology itself. I think the best interpretations of the archaeological evidence tend to be made by those who have got first-hand experience of the nature of archaeology, of excavating, of interpreting, of recording materials, of writing descriptions of artifacts and descriptions of excavations. So I think the archaeological process is hugely important in avoiding some artificial selection or artificial biases in the record. You know, I'm familiar with people coming into archaeology from disciplines such as philosophy or psychology or linguistics, and being rather selective about the evidence they use, and not really appreciating all the many different issues there are about interpreting the evidence and how that record can be biased. So I think if we're going to have a prehistory of the mind, archaeology have got at the forefront of there. And some of those archaeologists, at least, have got to have that real first-hand experience of being involved with archaeological data and its recovery. And so with myself, I mean, I do a lot of excavation as much as I can. And I really value that first-hand experience of dealing with the data in the ground, getting out of the ground and writing those reports. So I think that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is the exact converse. We have to work in an interdisciplinary manner because archaeology alone isn't going to give us the answers. So we have to work with drawing on the theories, the data, the ideas, the methods of psychologists, philosophers, linguistics, anthropologists, geographers, because they all have something to contribute. And the challenge is how to get these different disciplines to work together in the most constructive way. Because just as I've said about people from other disciplines coming to archaeology being selective about what they use, well, I do that to other disciplines. You know, I'll read psychology, I'll read some philosophy, and I'll pick and choose what seems to be best for my approach. So we all, to some extent, are predators on other people's disciplines and all their hard work. And, you know, how can we not be? The most important thing is try to get everybody into a room, a virtual room or a virtual space, and work together. And I think emerging out of that interdisciplinary research is the best way to try to control for that selection and that biases that we inadvertently come to in the past. Now, ideally, we should do that working as a group. On the other, sometimes I think you do have to go it alone a bit. And the books I've written, I've often written that they've been single authored, and I've often looked at, you know, I've read around the disciplines and I think, yeah, that's right, that's right, that's right. And I've tried to construct them together to get a narrative. So I think sometimes you do need to, you know, stick your head above the parapets and say, well, I think this is how it all works together. And most of the time you get shot down and it can be extremely painful. But that's the way that I think the discipline progresses, partly by your sole attempt of being brave and putting ideas out there, and partly working collaboratively, interdisciplinary, trying to get some consensus view.
Okay, can I ask one additional question about evidence? So how does absence of something serve as a supporting evidence in relation to the evolution of the human mind?
Yeah.
I'm thinking about lack of abstract thinking or symbolic thinking. So how we do that?
Well, it's yeah, I mean, that's the big question, isn't it? You know, that's the massive question. So, you know, if we take, well, let's go back to the Neanderthals again. You know, we say, well, the Neanderthals didn't have any symbols or figurative art, at least. Okay. Well, maybe they made lots of figurative art in ice or in plant material, or they carved them in bone, and they just haven't survived. And therefore, there's an absence of evidence, but it means that they did not necessarily lack those. And of course, yes, of course, that's absolutely true. So what do we do? Well, I think we have to set up, we have to work in the framework of more hypotheses. We have to say, on the basis of the current evidence, it appears that Neanderthals did not have figurative art. And I'll explain it like that. Now, that's a hypothesis that can be tested, because if anybody were to excavate a site and you found a little Neanderthal carved figurine of an animal or a person or a human face, that's come from a sealed context, which is undeniably Mousterian, Middle Paleolithic, that would simply falsify that hypothesis, and that's fine. Well, of course, people might say, oh, but you're just going to move the goalposts. You're going to find some reason why that's not a symbolic thing. And of course, we've got a good example of that lately. The dating of calcite over some of the art in caves from Spain have claimed that those handprints and some abstract signs were made by Neanderthals because they've claimed that they were 60,000 years ago. Wow, that's amazing. So that means Neanderthals were making images in caves, and why aren't they symbols? So that might be a lovely case where this absence of evidence issue is shown to being falsified by the advance of new scientific techniques. Now, personally, I remain skeptical about those dating techniques. I think there's huge issues about dating of that calcite, and until it's replicated elsewhere, I remain unpersuaded. But that is a case where you can use the absence of evidence to set up hypotheses, and then they can be falsified, and that is, of course, good science. But what I would want to stress is that absence of evidence isn't an issue that's unique to archaeology. All scientific disciplines face this. You know, if you're a cosmologist trying to work out the origin of the universe, you're going to have the absence of evidence. You can't ever say you've got all the evidence. If you're a historian writing about 19th century Britain, there's going to be some absence of evidence there. This is an issue that archaeologists face, but so do academics in all disciplines. We all have to work with the absence of evidence. And it's a challenge for all of us.
Yeah, and we should think about strategies for that. So I like in your interpretation, for example, when you are talking about traces of evidence of language-mediated behaviors. So that's great for me to think about traces of something that is language-mediated and something that is not. So can you explain that?
Okay. I suspect there's some things that we humans do. And if you haven't got spoken language, by which I mean compositional language with a lexicon and a grammar, it's going to be very difficult to do. So I think I would challenge, I mean, here's an example, a simple example, Monika. I mean, if you asked me, how can I, Steve, can you tell me how I get to the station? Well, it'd be very difficult for me to sing you some musical notes to tell you how to get to the station if I haven't got words to do that. So I think there's some things that communication is just very difficult without language itself. So when we look at the archaeological record, when we see this with modern humans, especially after the end of the Ice Age, where we see this ratchet effect of culture, where we see to have a culture becomes cumulative, I think that requires spoken language for transmitting detailed technical information from one generation to another. And when we're seeing in the archaeological record this immense cultural stasis archaeologically, Neanderthals were making the same sorts of tools year after year for hundreds of thousands of years, let alone the Homo gaster making their hand axes for hundreds of thousands of years. I think that's behavior which is not language mediated, because without spoken language, it's very difficult to have cultural progression, if you like, and cultural accumulation going on from one generation to the next. So I think language, the cultural ratchet effect that we see is language mediated behavior. But what I would emphasize is language is not just about transmitting information. It's about maintaining thoughts. And this is why I think words are really important. And in my current research, I'm looking back to work by people like Benjamin Lee Whorf and Edward Sapir about language relativism. Because I think what happened with modern humans around 100,000 years ago is that they invented words, and words acted as anchors for really complex new concepts that without words are rather difficult to hold in the mind. Let me give you an example. We see words changing all the time to ourselves. You know, here's a good example: Brexit. You know, we had huge difficulty communicating about Brexit. We didn't really know what Brexit was until we had a word for it. And now we talk about Brexit, it's fine. Still, nobody really knows what it means. But if you haven't got that word, you can't even start conversing about it. So I think it was probably the same for early humans, not talking about Brexit, but talking about different types of tools, talking about symbols, talking about journeys they wanted to go on to. Unless they had the words for them, they couldn't maintain the concepts in their minds. And without the concepts in the mind, they couldn't think abstract thoughts about those. So language mediates behavior in two ways. It mediates it by allowing better communication, passing on factual information, and it mediates it by thinking about things in a more coherent way, maintaining complex concepts in the mind. And I think that's critical for all the human behavior we see during the late Ice Age and after the Ice Age, such as the origins of farming and so forth. I think language was critical for that. If you didn't have words, you couldn't have invented farming.
Yeah, that's great. But yeah, I would like to ask one more question about the evidence. Maybe it's important to discuss a little bit ambivalent interpretation about evidence in archaeology between scholars and general public. For example, I would like to ask you about the flute from Divje Babe site from the Slovenia. Can you discuss how we differentiate? Is that archaeological evidence for some music, or is it something else? So
okay, you've picked one of the most difficult artifacts because professional archaeologists themselves are divided between this. And for anybody watching, the so-called flute from Divje Babe cave in Slovenia is a piece of bear femur. I think it's a femur from a bear, and it's got at least two, potentially more, circular pierced holes in it. So it's a cylinder with two pierced holes in it. So it looks like a flute, or looks like it could be used as a flute or some sort of blowing instrument. And that's how it was originally published and claimed. Now, other archaeologists have looked at that piece and they've done various microscopic analysis of it. And they've actually claimed that it's in fact a bone from a bear that's been chewed by a carnivore. And the holes are piercings coming from the canine teeth through the bone that have a coincidental look like they're artificially made. So it's being a bone flute. And they say there's other scratches on it that suggests this is just a chewed piece of bone that coincidentally looks like a flute. Other archaeologists have gone back and looked at it again, and they've supported the idea that it was artificially manufactured. So within the profession of archaeology, professional archaeologists have come to different interpretations of it. Now, I've never examined it personally. I've only seen the secondhand reports, and my inclination is more likely to be a chewed piece of bone that has an incidental appearance of a flute rather than a flute itself, but I'm open to be persuaded. This makes it extremely difficult for the general public because they will see that there's different interpretations there. So did Neanderthals make flutes or not? Well, I think we just have to live with that difference of opinion. And what I'd like the general public to do is to actually engage with the arguments themselves, is to engage with the archaeology. You know, these two alternatives, they're not difficult to understand. And I think that archaeologists and journalists particularly should enhance their communication to the public to make clear that these artifacts are not one or the other, but they're contested. And the general public can join in that process of debating and arguing and so forth. Now, of course, it's a bit of a dilemma for archaeologists, because what archaeologists would like to find the very first ever Neanderthal flutes. And we're all very guilty of promoting our own discoveries as being the most important, the most wonderful find, and not perhaps as good saying, but you know, there's this issue and this issue and so forth. So there is a great there is a dilemma about how we communicate. And I think we should do more effort at communicating the challenges of archaeology, rather than archaeology is all about treasure hunting and finding great finds and discovering these things. And I still find students at my university, they come and start their degrees in archaeology, and they still think it is about treasure hunting a bit, rather than that sort of really challenging high-level academic discipline of meticulously recovering and meticulously trying to interpret evidence, and being prepared to accept that there's alternative interpretations that need to be debated and discussed before any conclusion can be found. And of course, one of the great things we have seen over the last decade is huge advances in science communication from all disciplines, whether it's cosmology or archaeology or biology or genetics, hugely improved on what it used to be a decade ago. And we need to keep doing that with archaeology to bring the public into our discussions, into our debates. And that's partly why I'm so interested in community archaeology as well, because I think the public have got lots to offer and we should respect their opinions, but make sure their opinions can be as informed as some professional archaeologists.
Yeah, I like that you stress that we use different lines of evidence and different approaches, and that we should not just give results, but archaeology is thinking also. So when we are on thinking, what would you say about the position of prehistoric archaeology today among the sciences that combines epistemology of hard sciences, social sciences, as well as humanities?
Well, golly, I mean, archaeology is just such an amazing discipline that it is so broad, and it becomes more, it becomes broader almost by every year. It's clearly a discipline that you need hard scientific methodology sit at the center of no difference from other disciplines itself. On the other hand, it does deal with people in the past. And, as we know, people are pretty unpredictable, difficult to understand, and we need to bring in some humanities approaches for understanding that. So it is a discipline where ideally you need to understand both scientific methodology and a lot of areas of hard science, especially for the analysis of data that we dig up. We can apply chemistry, biology, genetics to all of that. But when it comes to the interpretation, we need also to draw on the humanities just as much. The humanities understands issues about contested interpretations, about understanding ambiguities, understanding about human motivations. We need to try to bring those together. And that challenge is where so much of the tensions in archaeology lie, and why it is both such a challenging discipline and such an intellectually demanding discipline. I think, what I've seen in the last 10 years I suppose it's been a huge revolution in archaeology. The second great revolution in archaeology. The first one was, of course, about radiocarbon dating, as from the 50s. And recently we've had human genomics, which has just transformed what we can do by being able to extract genetic data from human skeletal remains, and also from modern human genetic diversity. And this has transformed so much of what we understand about the past, not just about human evolution, but the dispersal and migrations of people, how cultures have mixed and so forth. And this has really revolutionized archaeology for the second time after radiocarbon dating was done. And so the challenge is trying to be able to engage with that revolution and understand how it transforms our understanding, and trying to work with those geneticists who, in a way can say so much more about the past than we've been able to do for many, many, many years. So it's a continually evolving discipline, so broad, so demanding, and that's what makes it such interesting and fascinating. and why, precisely why it can address some of these huge questions about being human. If it didn't have that breadth and that challenge, it wouldn't even be able to ask those questions themselves.
So we are living definitely in gray times, as Christian Christiansen said in his also article about scientific revolution with the implementation of genetics today. But maybe for this crisis of COVID-19, I can ask you something about what can we learn about plasticity of human mind and creativity in the human evolution, which might be useful for the contemporary world in this COVID-19 crisis. So help us, please.
Archaeology, but not just archaeology, history, the past, gives us one really big lesson that I think is useful for when we think about COVID. That societies go through bad times, they come out of bad times, and they can make themselves the better for it. Okay, and I think that's a huge lesson. The classic case, I think, is what the West, and more particularly my country, Britain, went through during the Second World War. That was a hard time. People had, they lost loved ones, they fought. It was a terrible, terrible time. When we came out of the Second World War in Britain, we remade our society. We had a new government. We created our National Health Service, which is, of course, we're very proud of in this country. That was very much a consequence of those challenging times during the war and during the 1930s, and recognizing that we need to remake our society in a better way. And I think that's a lesson we can do with COVID now. What COVID has done is to expose so many of the inequalities in society. As you know, the UK has suffered especially poorly in terms of the number of deaths. This has exposed, even more so than aware of, the difference between the rich and the poor in our country, those who are socially well off, those who are deprived. It's exposed how ethnic minorities are so often some of the most deprived people. Now, we knew all of that already, but I think it's exposed it even more, made it more public. And what I hope is that we can come out of COVID and take that lesson from the past, that we can remake our society in a more positive way. So COVID does give us some particular lessons for that. The past does give us some lessons. Of course, what the past also shows us is that as a species, we are continually flexible. It's only 10,000 years ago that we're living as hunter-gatherers. That's amazing. It's incredible. We had no cities, no towns at all. And within that short space of time, we changed our society so quickly. We can look at technical revolutions, look at the impact of, well, you could say the spear thrower among hunter-gatherers, or the bow of arrow. And then later you can look at the technical revolution that was the invention of agriculture and how these transformed our societies. And then, the classic case like the invention of the wheel. And then in more recent times, the invention of modern medicine. So we are a society that can invent new technologies that address key problems and also change the way we organize our societies to change problems. And that's clearly partly what we've been doing through COVID. The huge progress in using online platforms for meetings, for interviews like this, for discussion, for teaching and so forth. I think we've moved our societies on by about 10 years in the space of about 1 year. And we can hope that there can be more technical fixes to COVID, like the huge, brilliant inventions of scientists with these vaccines. And, some people hope we're going to be able to do the same with climate change as well, that there might be a technical fix for that. I'm skeptical about that. I think it's more about human behavior and society and changing the way we organize ourselves. But I'd like to think that the lessons of the past, from the deepest prehistory until our very recent past, tell us that as a society and as individuals, we can change our behavior to make society the better. And I hope that's a lesson we're going to learn when we come out of COVID, and hopefully when we come out of climate, the huge challenge of climate change, which I think is probably more serious than COVID at the moment that we're facing as a planet.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would say that were amazing what you said. And it's nice to conclude there because that's some hope in your words. Thank you very much. It was an honor to speak to you. Thank you very much for being with us today. And to all of you out there who are interested and would like to know more about the project Sciences of the Origin, make sure to follow us on Twitter, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and visit our website listed below. So thank you, Steve. You're amazing.
Thank you so much, Monika. It's been very enjoyable. And good luck with the rest of the series. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.